immigration.com, your go-to resource for U.S. immigration insights. We provide clear immigration news and information. Our platform provides a network of licensed attorneys who can answer your questions and guide you through the process. From visas to green cards, asylums to citizenships, immigrationquestion.com helps you to network with immigration attorneys so that you can move forward with confidence. Sign up today or download the app. Free registration, limited time offer. Stay tuned. We go live in 30 seconds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar brought to you by immigrationquestion.com, a networking platform and meeting ground where immigrants, families, advocates, and licensed immigration attorneys come together to learn, exchange information, and stay current on U.S. immigration developments. My name is GB Satusa, and I'll be your host for today's session, Current DHS and ICE Enforcement Priorities and their Practical Impact on Undocumented and Non-Citizen Communities. Changes in enforcement priorities at the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement directly affect undocumented individuals and non-citizens across the United States. Policy shifts can influence who is targeted for enforcement, how cases are prioritized, and what risks individuals may face during routine encounters with immigration authorities. Today's webinar is designed to provide a practical explanation of current DHS and ICE enforcement priorities and what they mean in everyday terms. We'll discuss how these policies are applied, what factors may increase enforcement risk, and what individuals and families should understand about their rights and available legal options. To guide us through this important topic, we are joined by Vilerka Solange Bilbao, Esquire, an immigration attorney dedicated to helping individuals and families navigate enforcement issues, removal concerns, and immigration relief options. She provides strategic legal insight to help clients understand their rights and make informed decisions during uncertain times. Attorney Bilbao, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the live stream.
Thank you.
Now, before we begin, a quick note for everyone tuning in. ImmigrationQuestion.com is a public platform created for networking, education, and discussion. Attorneys who participate do so independently, and the platform does not provide individualized legal advice. To everyone joining us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and other platforms, welcome. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. Now let's begin. Let's start with the broader enforcement landscape. Now, Attorney Bilbao, can you explain what the current enforcement priorities of DHS and ICE are and how these priorities are being applied in practice today?
Yes, definitely. So I think it's one thing to understand that there are certain stated priorities by the government, and then there's what's happening operationally, the reality of what's happening on the ground. So the Department of Homeland Security is saying that they are emphasizing their priorities on individuals with certain criminal convictions. We're talking, felonies, things that are deportable offenses, individuals with prior removal orders, so where they've already gone through their case and an immigration judge has said, yes, this person is supposed to be deported to X country. They're also prioritizing people who have recently come into the United States. They are expanding their use of expedited removal in all cases that they believe qualify. And I say that with a grain of salt because traditionally, expedited removal was for people who were coming in through the border. And then at that time, the government could, in an expedited manner, decide if that person was to stay or not, or whether they could apply for asylum. And the person would be subject to mandatory detention during that encounter. However, they are expanding it so anyone who entered through the border, whether it was 30 years ago or 5 minutes ago, they are subjecting them to that mandatory detention and expedited removal process, which is problematic because then we have a ton of people detained. And then the other thing that they have stated as a priority is the increased use of the 287G agreements with local law enforcement. So these are contracts that the Department of Homeland Security and ICE has with local law enforcement to ensure that there is collaboration between the counties, the county jails, the county police, and then ICE. So that is their stated priorities. There's other things that they are also doing, which is enforcing deportation through adjudication. So basically, they are making much more difficult decisions, sometimes even legally incorrect decisions in cases, which then leads a person to end up in the deportation pipeline. So, for example, if you are doing a marriage-based filing, you are going to find yourself with higher scrutiny. You're going to find yourself having to document your marriage a lot more. You might be subject to a visit from a USCIS field officer who might want to inspect your home to ensure that this is in fact a legitimate marriage. In asylum cases, we're seeing the same thing. We are seeing a lot of adjudications from USCIS, so they are going through and doing a lot of interviews, but that does not mean that those interviews are passing. I would probably estimate that about 97, 98% of the cases are then referred to an immigration judge where the person is more likely to be ordered removed. Another thing in enforcement that you're seeing is public charge related factors, which did not really used to apply to all cases, and yet USCIS might be applying them in types of relief that are not applicable. So what we're seeing is evolvement of the regulations. We're seeing a lot more fraud detection reviews, an increase in requests for evidence, an increase in noise. And if you don't respond to those things timely or with the evidence that they're requiring, then you're subject to being denied and then placed in removal proceedings in front of a judge. And then we're also seeing interagency data sharing. So we're not supposed to be sharing information. They are. These Medicaid offices might be sharing information with immigration. So the policy is there. The operational reality is that the official guidance may sound very narrow, like this just applies to this case, but in practice, it is being extended a lot more broadly. You have basically very minor administrative violations, which are triggering detention. So traditionally, a person may have entered with their visa, they may have overstayed, married a US citizen, applied for that I-130 and green card, which they were allowed to do, go to their USCIS interview, and somehow now they're being detained over that minor overstay. That did not used to happen. You would go to that interview and you would get approved, absent there being another, criminal immigration matter. So the other thing is a lot of arrests are happening that even without convictions or even arrests without probable cause, where they didn't have a reason to detain you in the first place, end up as an ICE transfer and ICE detention. So it's interesting because we just are seeing a lot more people ending up in the immigration deportation pipeline than there used to be, right? And that's their goal at the end of the day.
Now, which categories of non-citizens are currently at higher risk of enforcement actions, and what factors most often trigger ICE attention?
Yes. So I don't like to create fear, but I do want to be very realistic about what's happening. If you are not a US citizen and you have an encounter with immigration, you are at risk. Now, the level of that risk is going to be highly dependent on what those officers are doing in that moment, what type of encounter you're having. But anyone who is not a US citizen has some risk right now. Obviously, there's some people with much higher risk. So if you have a prior removal order and you encounter even a police officer that now have the ability to go in and check immigration records, you are at risk of being detained, right? So if you have a prior removal order, that's a big category. Anyone who has been under ICE supervision, whether you have an I-220A on an order of release on recognizance, where you have an immigration case pending, maybe it's been years, you're checking in yearly or every 6 or 8 months, or if it's an I-220B, an order of supervision where you have an old removal order, but for some reason they haven't deported you maybe humanitarian reasons, maybe your country doesn't want you back. All of those people who have encounters with ICE are at very high risk of being detained, whether or not they have a criminal history or not. Individuals with a criminal history, especially anything that's violent, and it doesn't matter if you were charged and convicted of that crime, even if that crime was dismissed. So let's say you had an old DUI years ago, there was an arrest, somehow that case was dismissed, you are still at risk because that's on your profile. So when they run your name, that still comes out. The officer on the street might not do the investigation fully to understand, hey, that case was dismissed, right? They're just going to see, hey, this person previously had a DUI, right? Or a previous domestic violence phone call with the police, even though it didn't result in official charges. So I think those are the bigger categories of people who are at risk. The other thing that is a common ICE trigger is any type of traffic stop. We've even seen it of people who call the police after a traffic accident and they're not at fault, and somehow that ends up in an ICE detention. So any type of encounter with law enforcement is going to put you at risk. Of course, like I said, it depends on the situation of the day. Like, let's say that if you call the police after a car accident, which is what we're all legally supposed to do, okay? So you're following the law. If that officer is not authorized to do any immigration inspection and you have your driver's license in order and you can speak to the officer in English, you're way less likely to end up in ICE custody. But if you don't have a driver's license at that moment, you can't speak to them in their language in English, then it's more probable that that officer is going to say, hey, I think this is an immigrant that might not have paperwork. Let's go ahead and run their name and fingerprints. So there's a lot of factors involved. And then there's also some places that are bigger hot spots than others. For example, I'm in Florida, the counties of Orange County, which is Orlando. The mayor has been saying that they've been arresting people without charges and holding them for immigration detention. They acknowledge it. This is happening all over Florida, but there are places in the country where this might not be happening because the police may not be as cooperative with ICE. So it depends also on where you're at.
All right. Now, how are these enforcement priorities showing up in real life for undocumented individuals and mixed status families, including encounters at home, at work, or during routine interactions?
Yeah, so really immigration enforcement can really happen anywhere. I think the bigger categories are at home. There is a number of people who are seeing ICE step into their home. Usually they tend to do early morning visits. They use, for the most part, an administrative warrant that's presented as authority to detain this individual. And basically the communities where this is happening are sort of active in following ICE around and trying to make sure that people don't open their doors. I think it's important for people to understand that they do have constitutional rights when it comes to their home. Police, any type of police, be it Homeland Security investigations or ICE, they are not allowed into your home unless either A, you give them permission, which you don't need to. Okay, you have total right to say, no, I don't allow you to enter. Or two, they have a warrant signed by a judge to enter your home. Okay, so if you are at home, you never need to open the door to them. You can ask them to pass the paperwork under the door. And one thing that I always tell people so that they're not confused, well, is it a warrant that a judge signed or how do I know? If they have a warrant signed by a judge, they will knock and tear down the door. They don't need your permission. If they are knocking and saying, hey, can we come in? The thing is, they don't have a judicial warrant. Okay, so do not be afraid if ICE is coming at your door and knocking at your door, even if you have the person inside who they are looking for. You do not have to give them that information and you do not have to let them into your house. There's a constitutional protection about that. What happens is that ICE makes their own internal warrants, which is what they call these administrative warrants. And they call them the same thing as the judicial warrants. And so people get confused, right? And they're like, well, we have a warrant. but it's one created by ICE. And so that one doesn't count to knock down my door and either search my home or find a person. So that's very important. The home is technically the safest place. Okay. Now, at work, enforcement is a little bit different. At work, ICE is showing up usually to do I-9 audits to verify that the people who are working in that company have the correct paperwork to be employed. Usually, they're showing up at companies who may have a lot of individuals with who are undocumented. It may be a little bit industry specific. So if you have a factory, you might be at a bigger risk. If you are in a construction sort of world, you might be at bigger risk. And the employers, it's important to understand that they also have rights. They do not have to let ICE in to every single place. ICE is not allowed into, let's say, the back of a restaurant. That's for employees only. You don't have to give them access to that. You may have to give them access and they may be able to walk around where the public walks around. But if you have employees in your back kitchen, you do not have to let them in. And it's important that employers consult with attorneys to understand what their rights are, because if ICE violates these rights, then you can sue them, right? And you can go against the agency for what they're doing. Those are two big ones. I think the other ones are the routine encounters, which are at traffic stops. You're driving a car, it's the easiest way to get pulled over. A police encounters you, you're not able to speak the language is usually one of the big triggers, or you don't have a driver's license or a work permit that you can show. And then at that point, they run your name through a database and call an officer who has immigration authority to detain you. As for mixed status families, which I know that you talked about, I think that it's important for families to have a plan. Okay. My number one thing when I'm working with mixed status families is to ensure that children can be picked up from daycare or from school. If both parents don't have documents and they are somehow picked up in a car, somebody needs to pick up those kids and have authority to pick them up, which means there needs to be a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident already registered with the daycare or school as an authorized person to pick them up. If nobody picks them up, then you're calling the school is calling the Department of Children and Families or CPS, Child Protective Services, whatever that name is in your state. And then the children usually end up in state custody, and it is really hard to fight that. Not impossible, but it's another headache apart from the parents being detained. So I think that's the number one thing that parents should know when you're in a mixed status family. The other thing is to make sure that you have all your documents sort of prepared and in order in case somebody else needs to access them. Everything is sort of in one place.
Now, what practical steps should non-citizens know if they are approached, questioned, or detained by immigration officers? And what common mistakes should they avoid?
Yes. So I think some of the first things is knowing some core rights. You do have the right to remain silent, and you do not have to answer questions to an officer. So when an officer pulls you over or stops you, an officer is supposed to have something called probable cause, meaning they have more than a suspicion that you are committing a crime, right? They have probable cause to believe that you've committed a crime. The more information that you give them, the more information that they have against you. So you have a right to remain silent. If they ask you for your ID, you might provide it to them and you might say, I don't answer questions without my attorney present. That's my favorite line if clients are able to say it. I don't answer any questions without my attorney present. That way they know that you are not going to answer anything, that you want you want to be able to speak to counsel. If they have enough to arrest you, they will arrest you anyways. So you don't have to give them anything else. Now, if they don't have enough to arrest you and they still do, now that's an arrest without probable cause. And you will be able to fight that with an attorney afterwards. Okay. I always tell people if you're in front of law enforcement and they want to arrest, whether they have the legal basis to do so or not, they'll do it. They have that power. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But we don't have to give them anything extra. Right? So you don't have to answer any questions about your day, about where you've been, about what you did in the last hour. Nothing, right? I don't answer questions without my attorney present. That might get you out a lot of the time. Now, I understand that people get very nervous in front of law enforcement. I do too, right? It's normal. They have that power in front of us, and they are trained to make you want to talk, right? Because they say, well, if you talk to me, I can help you out. But the majority of the times, the more you talk, the more you dig yourself in. So that's one thing. You have the right to refuse signing any documents, especially if you do not understand them. And that is another big one that I think immigrants should be aware of. When you end up in ICE custody, the first thing that they are going to try to do is convince you that you aren't able to stay in this country. And for some people, that might be a reality. Okay. For some people, they're just buying time, right? They're trying to stay here for as long as possible before they need to leave. It's good that you have a conversation with your attorney as soon as possible so that you know if that is your situation, what you would do. Because it might be easier at that point to sign your own voluntary departure and leave to your country. Now, people who have prior removal orders won't be pressured to sign anything because they don't need to. They can just take that old removal order and deport that person right away. So I would say declining to sign anything that you don't understand up until you speak with an attorney about it. And the other core right is that most of us will be able to request bond from immigration. Now, not all of us. There are some limitations in the law. If you've been convicted of certain crimes, you likely will never be able to get a bond. But absent convictions of grave crimes, most people will be able to seek a bond from immigration, even though the timeframes differ. So, for example, somebody who entered with a visa, right now, if you're detained in immigration, you're able to get a bond hearing. You file your motion, maybe a week and a half later, you get your bond hearing. That judge might say that same day whether you can get out. If you entered without a visa, if you enter through the border, then you're probably going to have to go to federal court, depending on where you are, in which state, and you might have to fight for that release, and it might take about 3 months. But you still are able to get out of immigration detention. So I think understanding those core rights are important for people to understand so that an ICE officer doesn't just take advantage and tell you, hey, you're not eligible for anything, you can't stay here, just sign this, this is the easiest thing to do. And for some people, that will be the best scenario, but it's good to know if that's you so that then you can take advantage of that opportunity. Now, as to practical guidance when you are in front of immigration officers, I think you should always ask officers to identify themselves, to pass you that warrant under the door. Do not open the door for the warrant under the door, okay? You should carry your immigration documentation if you are lawfully present. So if you have a work permit, carry that with you. If you have a green card, you're required to carry that with you. If you have any other type of immigration paperwork that's pending or approved, carry a copy of the receipt. You don't have to carry the original. Okay, I don't want anything getting lost. And then also memorizing your emergency contacts, because if you are detained, you want to be calling someone that you can trust and letting them know where you are. It takes a few days at least for you to appear in any immigration detention system. So if you're arrested today, your family will not be able to find you, maybe for 3 or 4 days. And it depends on how they process you. So you need to be able to have a phone number where you can call and tell them, hey, I'm in this place. Hey, they're moving me. They haven't told me where I'm going. Okay, because the system is just behind. And then in terms of mistakes, the biggest one I would say is do not give them false information. Do not tell them that you're a U.S. citizen if you're not. That is actually a federal offense, and you could be deported just for that. So be very careful with that. I would not sign a voluntary departure order or even a deportation order without speaking to an attorney to understand what that means for you. For some individuals, a voluntary departure order might mean that you can go home in a few days, but it might also mean that you can't come back to the country in 10 years. Same thing as a deportation order. For others, a deportation order might be a 20-year ban or a forever ban where you can't ever come back to the United States. So understanding not only what you're signing, but also the consequences that it'll have on anything that you request in the future is important. I would never open the door for somebody knocking in my house. If they're knocking on the door, it means that they don't have a judicial warrant, so you don't need to let them in. And then the other big mistake is over-explaining, volunteering information that they're not asking you. The less information that they know, the better. I would say this other caveat: most officers are not making the decisions themselves. Sometimes the orders come from above. So the order might already be, if you encounter this person, you're arresting them, and this is where you're taking them. It doesn't matter what you tell the officer, that's already what's going to end up happening. So you don't need to give them anything additional. That officer is not likely going to be able to help you in your case at all.
Now, how do current enforcement practices affect lawfully present non-citizens, such as visa holders, TPS recipients, or those with pending applications?
Yeah, so it used to be that if you had a visa, you have a pending application, you weren't really subject to being detained unless you were committing a crime. And so that's sort of like a different category of people. And we all understand that, right? Like somebody's committing a DUI, burglared up a store, then we understand that those people should be subject to detention. Now, you could be following all the rules. And if you encounter ICE, you could be detained. And it's a reality, right? We don't want to hide from that reality. We want people to be prepared, because the more prepared you are, the less likely that you end up in detention. So there's just more scrutiny. There's more travel risk. I am telling all of my people who do not have a valid visa or a valid green card that they should not be traveling domestically, when 2 years ago they could get on a plane and go to New York, go to Vegas, go to California, and that wasn't an issue. But you are going through TSA and you're going through potential immigration detention if they somehow flag your name for some reason or want to do an extra inspection. I think, for example, for TPS individuals, you are so dependent on the renewal cycles. TPS for Yemen, for example, was eliminated this morning. So you are at the mercy of the US government. Anyone who has the TPS should be very careful planning any outside travel, not only domestically, but if they leave the country and have to come back in case status just expires or somehow gets eliminated while they're gone. And they should also be looking for other alternatives if they can turn that into a family petition, a business petition, talent-based, because they are at risk as well, right? TPS was never meant to be permanent. So everyone is at risk. Those who have pending applications, if your underlying status somehow expires, so that example that I gave earlier about someone who applied for their green card through marriage, their visa was expired while they're waiting, either while they're waiting or before applying, they're at risk of being detained. If you get that case denied, you're being issued an NTA, so you're being put in court. And NTA is that notice to appear before a judge. So you're being put in the deportation machine. And then there's actual vulnerability during interviews, because that is where those individuals are likely to be detained if they find any immigration violation. And then you also have a little bit of risk to even lawful permanent residents, because there are travel risks if you have criminal history. There has always been that for certain crimes. We don't recommend people with green cards to travel if they've had certain crimes, because it can trigger a deportation process when they come back into the country. But now, even for minimal criminal history, we think that it's they're running their names and seeing their criminal history, so it can also trigger deportation proceedings. If you are out of the country for more than 6 months, they're being more strict on that abandonment. And they're also reviewing cases for fraud. So if there is even something questionable in your green card, even though it was issued years ago, you could be called in for an interview. Your case could be reviewed, and especially when you're traveling, you could go through an interview at that point. So there is an impact as well on everyone who's here lawfully doing the right thing.
Right. Now, what proactive legal and practical planning strategies can individuals, families, and employers adopt now to reduce risk and stay prepared amid ongoing enforcement uncertainty?
Yeah, so there's a lot, and it really depends on your individual case. I think the first thing is sort of do a legal audit with each person, and determine what their current status is. Um, a lot of individuals maybe have an expired green card that they need to renew. They have status, they're okay, but they don't have documentation to prove that, right? So make sure that you have your status and that you're able to show that in case you're encountered by ICE. The other thing is determining if an old removal order exists. So there will be individuals who have a green card and who have some status now, who have an old removal order. And that old removal order may technically not be applicable, but if you're pulled over, it'll come up in the system if it hasn't been withdrawn. And so that might lead you to detention. So if that exists, make sure that you start working on how to eliminate that. I would obtain FOIA records for every single individual. We already do this as part of working with clients. Your FOIA records is what the government has on you. And so there's different agencies, the FBI, USCIS, INS previously, if you have an older case, Department of Justice, there's ICE, there could be CBP. All of these agencies have different records on you. And so, for example, you might have an old removal order from CBP for having entered through the border years ago and not know that that's there. And then subsequently got in a work permit, subsequently applied for something. But if you encounter an ICE officer, they can pull that up and they can say, oh, wait, I could just deport you with this, right? So having your records is really good to see what you have and see where your risks are. And then the other part that I would do is making sure that you understand what you're eligible for. Sometimes I work with individuals that their eligibility is so weak, and all we're doing is maybe buying time here in the United States up until they have to leave. There are other individuals who have really strong cases, right? If you do, you should be pursuing those, right? And understand which ones are worth sort of waiting on and which ones are worth pushing on. Because if you have relief right now, you should be trying to get it. There's plenty of people who could become, for example, US citizens right now who are green card holders. There's no risk to applying. And what happens is once you're a US citizen, all of this immigration headache goes away, right? So right now, if you are eligible for that and you speak to an attorney, go for it. But let's say a green card holder who had an old DUI, I might tell them, you know what, let's not do this right now. Let's wait because you might get a negative decision from an officer right now. It's not worth it, right? So it's understanding how strong your case is and when to push for it. Now, there are some emergency things that I think people should be doing. We talked about the children, making sure that there's someone who's authorized to take your children from school and daycare. But beyond that, you might have guardianship planning. So you might want your kids to stay in the United States. You might have an auntie or a friend who says, you know what, I'll take care of your kids if you do have to leave. And so there are certain documents, power of attorneys, maybe guardianship to give to a child or to a step parent, to a family member or to a step parent to make sure that they're able to take care of that child, that they're able to enroll them in school, take them to the doctor's office, things like that. For children, for example, if you are at risk of being removed and you have US citizen children, I would make sure that you are getting them passports already because it's much more difficult to get them passports when you're abroad. I would, for example, make sure that there is a plan of if they do have to travel to meet you in another country, who is going to take those children. You don't do any powers of attorneys for children's travel up until the travel plans are done, which means you have a flight. I know exactly what flight they're getting on and who's going with them, but you might want to maybe save the money and have that in a separate account for them. There might be some financial planning for families. If there's business accounts that maybe need someone to take them over if you're detained, you might want to add another person into your account so that they're able to manage your finances. So everything is very specific to the family and what they're going through. And you can speak to your immigration attorney about this. Depending on their level of services, they might refer you to someone for certain parts of that, right? Like We might not do guardianship in our office, but if our client needs that, we'll connect them to the attorney who does that service. I know that there are some people planning, for example, adoption and I have a person lined up to adopt my children if I have to leave. It's very, very dependent on each family. And then there are also things that employers can do to prepare. So the first thing is making sure that you're doing internal I-9 audits, which means making sure that when you are hiring, you do have the correct documentation for individuals, that you are checking those social security numbers, those work permits, that you're ensuring that none of those work permits lapse while the person has a job. Usually what happens is that the employer checks it today, the day that I hire, and then maybe 10 years later, that person is still with you, but you are not checking those documents continuously. And so as an employer, you may be at fault for that. It would be good if employers had response protocols. If ICE visits, what do we do? How do we protect our employees, right? Like, what is it that ICE can and cannot do? Maybe what do we tell our employees if ICE is here, and ensure that they're in the back of the house and not in the front-facing part of the house? And then the other thing that I would do is maybe set up a consultation with attorneys to see if you are able to sponsor individuals. Because if you already have employees who are non-US citizens, you may be in an industry where you want that. I, for example, have lots of individuals who are attorneys from other countries who we have here in the United States. I think it's a great talent to have here. So you might already be in an industry where you say, you know what, I want this talent. It's very good. They come maybe even with higher training, and figure out how you can sponsor individuals, because if you are already employing them, you might be able to be an ally and sponsor individuals to get their green card, so that as they work for you, they're also earning their legal status.
Thank you so much, Attorney. What an interesting session it's been so far. Now, for everyone watching, understanding enforcement priorities is not about creating fear, it's about awareness. Policy shifts can affect how cases are reviewed, how encounters unfold, and what legal strategies may be necessary. Being informed helps individuals and families make measured decisions rather than reactive ones. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. ImmigrationQuestion.com is a networking platform where users can ask immigration-related questions at no cost and engage with participating attorneys. We're also proud to share with you that ImmigrationQuestion.com is B accredited and ISO certified, reflecting our commitment to transparency, accountability, community education, and security. Now, Attorney Bilbao, based on your experience and a regular appearance on our live stream, how do platforms like ImmigrationQuestion.com help immigrants and immigration attorneys such as yourself?
I think it helps tremendously that there's information being put on by so many of us about what's going on in the reality. A lot of people believe that because the information is online and sometimes the instructions are online to do a lot of this, that they can just apply on their own. And that used to be the case maybe 20 years ago, to be honest. There were so many processes that could be done. But just to give you a sort of an idea, just last year, 2025, there were over 400 changes in the law in immigration. Whether it was a policy, a regulation, a whole memo that the government brought in, whole laws, whole programs that were taken out, some that were added. So with that amount of changes, it's impossible when your case takes multiple years to really understand where your risks are. And so it's important that individuals get up-to-date information about what's going on. I love you guys' newsletter, weekly newsletter that shows all the changes. But it's important to be guided by someone who's doing this work all the time, so that they can tell you, hey, wait a second, this happened and this might affect you, right? Because if you're doing it on your own, you sort of put that application, you wait your 2 or 3 years for a decision. And if a million things change in the middle, you might not know what you need to do. So I love what you guys are doing. I think it definitely is helping a lot of people.
Thanks for those thoughts, Attorney. Now, before we move into our live Q&A, a final question. For undocumented individuals or mixed status families who are feeling heightened concern about enforcement activity, What signs should prompt them to seek legal guidance sooner rather than later?
Yeah, so I think all the signs are there. If you have someone in your family who doesn't have status, I think understanding that the later that you do this, it's going to be worse. And here's a great example. Most people will be eligible to ask for a bond in front of an immigration judge. But if you haven't filed a case in years of being here, the judge is more likely to say that you're a flight risk because you've been here for years and you haven't started anything, right? The other thing is sometimes we get these cases where individuals are picked up, they've never done anything before, they've never had anything criminal, but they've also haven't applied for anything. And so before I go to that immigration judge, I have to file something and say, hey, they do have a case that's pending. So you might delay your own time in detention because now you have to do extra work in order to be able to get that bond. So I always tell families, start as soon as you can, start as soon as you're eligible. You might come to an immigration attorney who tells you, you know what, you're not eligible for anything. I have those conversations, unfortunately, a lot of the time. And that's also good to know. So a lot of people are afraid to ask because they're like, what if I'm not eligible for anything? But you may ask, well, what could make me eligible, right? What could I do, right? Well, if you marry a U.S. citizen, if you marry a legal permanent resident, this would be your path, right? You're single, you're young, you go out there, right? Sometimes that's the conversation that we have. Or sometimes the conversation is, you know what, you're studying in college, try and find a sponsor. Or, you know what, you have a degree from your country, you can take voluntary departure and then come back through a visa program, through a sponsorship program. So knowing what you're eligible for or what you could become eligible for is also important. So I would say don't delay. It really only harms you if you delay your status.
If you've just joined us, we've been speaking with Vilerka Solange Bilbao, Esquire, on current DHS and ICE enforcement priorities and their practical impact on undocumented and non-citizen communities. If you are joining us now, you found us on the perfect time. We are now moving into our live Q&A session. This is your opportunity to ask questions directly to a licensed immigration attorney. Please drop your questions in the chat or call us live at 516-703-3483 and we'll take as many as possible. All right. Why was there Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota? And could something like that happen anyway?
This is very interesting. And I try not to be too political, right? But the reality is that immigration is political, okay? The president of the United States, whoever he or she is the head of the executive branch. And under the executive branch, you have immigration. And it's because it's a national security issue. So whenever you have a president come in, they sort of open the door to immigration or close the door to immigration. And so with this president in particular, he is being very aggressive. He's being very aggressive, usually in places where he wasn't supported. So he's going after cities and towns that usually are blue. So we think that that's why this happened in Minnesota. I am in a red state. I am in Florida. And that doesn't mean that things aren't happening. It's just it's happening, but it's much more quiet. So, for example, in Florida, we are having thousands of arrests from our Florida Highway Patrol, arrests without probable cause. There's no basis for arresting the person. And then they end up in immigration detention, right? So things are happening all over the country. I think that we just have to all know our rights, all understand where we are in our immigration pathway, and then have some sort of those decisions sort of made. I talk to a lot of clients who tell me, listen, if I get detained, I'm going to seek for my voluntary departure. I am not willing to sit in jail and fight this case. And then there's other individuals who tell me, I don't care if I'm detained for 3 years, I'm fighting my case, right? Everyone has sort of a different threshold depending on where they are with their families, where they are in life. But I don't want to say that it will happen everywhere because I don't think, I think that there's a political aspect to this that has nothing to do with individual cases. It's just, hey, this is a place that we want to target based on what's happening politically. And unfortunately, we have a president who is using that as a basis for re-election or whatever he's trying to do. So we have to take that into account. Sometimes the people that are being targeted are not really the worst of the worst. Like the DHS is saying, sometimes it's people who have a legal pathway, who have been doing their cases for years, who have been approved by the Department of Homeland Security to be here, and it's just they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I would say that this is more political than anything. And as much as you can, especially as immigrants, sort of step away from that, it's healthy, because if we are watching the news constantly about all this, it gets very, very depressing. And it's, we don't want people scared. We want people to know their rights. But also, the news cycle just makes it seem so much worse. It's not good, right? I'm not saying it's, but it's also, it looks like a war zone, right? Because we keep seeing those images over and over again. So, it could happen. I don't think it's likely to happen everywhere, just because there's some people who are collaborating much more with the government and collaborating much more with ICE in what they're trying to do.
All right. If I see ICE abusing immigrants in my community, can I report it, and how can I do that?
Okay, I love this question. So yes, we should be reporting, right? Whether it's ICE, HSI, FBI, anyone, any law enforcement agency that's abusing immigrants. So the first thing to know is that we have a right to record. You can pull out your cell phone and record whatever is happening. Try to keep it steady. Try to keep a distance, not too much of a distance, right? So that we can see it in the video, but enough of a distance to where you're not considered interfering, because that is what they're using in order to go after people who are sort of collateral. Okay, so definitely record it. What I would say is that the ACLU, American for Civil Liberties Union, is present in every single state. Okay, you can report things to them. You can also report things to an organization called AILA, American Immigration Lawyers Association. There are hundreds of groups of people doing things. So for example, right now in Florida, there are groups of people suing over Alligator Alcatraz for medical neglect. There are people suing in Alcatraz as well over access to attorneys, which sometimes they don't let us see clients. There are people starting to sue the sheriff's offices for their illegal arrest. So what we do when we find this information is we sort of find the groups who are going after these things and help them. So please, if you do see this, of course, report. I understand that it might be dangerous sometimes to report directly to the police, especially in a state that's collaborating with ICE. So I would say that those agencies, ACLU, they will put you in contact with maybe a group that's doing that. And then the other thing is that if you want to support this work, okay, go online and find immigration rights coalitions or immigration right groups. There are plenty of organizations helping, and there are many ways to help. There are individuals, for example, making sure that detainees get the right information over the phone, that detainees get their medication while they're detained, that families who don't speak the language maybe find a translator. Individuals who are helping children go to school or walk them home so that their undocumented parents don't have to be outside to pick them up from school. There are many ways to help the immigrant community. If you're inclined to do that, we definitely encourage it. Every grain of salt helps.
Right. ICE has been hiring many new agents. Does that mean more raids and deportations?
It may, yes. Although yesterday, there was a Senate bill that didn't pass that was about additional funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Yes, sometimes additional agents may mean more raids and more deportations. They will not tell us about them. They are not going to announce that, hey, we are doing this up until the day they are doing it, and then it's a marketing campaign for them. It may also be that they need additional people because of the number of people that they're detaining. So if you think at some points we had about 20,000 detainees in a month, that was the average nationwide. And now the average is over 70,000 people detained. So in order to process those cases, you're going to need just more individuals processing things. So sometimes if it's internal administrative work, we are not mad at that. And the reason is I don't want someone sitting in detention and us not being able to have a hearing for them for 2 months because ICE is behind on their paperwork. We do want, people to be able to have a quick hearing. So it doesn't necessarily always mean more raids and more deportations. Of course, there is the possibility for that. I think the deportations are also part of it is we do have a lot of people in this country who do have deportation orders that are 20 years old. I encounter them all the time, right? So sometimes individuals haven't fixed their status. They've been able to be here for a long time and they just have never or may never be able to correct it. So those deportation numbers, there's always going to be deportations, right? The ones that we get really mad about are the ones that are incorrectly processed, violating people's rights. Like those are the ones that we're sort of mad about. But yeah, it could mean more raids and more deportations. I mean, the more capacity they have, the more they could do.
Now, recent reporting highlights shifts within Homeland Security missions toward more deportation-focused enforcement strategies. Now, Attorney, how should communities interpret these mission shifts, and what do they signal about the direction of enforcement practices in the coming months?
Yeah, so it used to be that the Department of Homeland Security had HSI, which is Homeland Security Investigations, and sort of they were the ones tasked with investigating maybe like child sex exploitation investigations, human trafficking, national security related matters. What it's looking like, and there's no real confirmation from the Department of Homeland Security about all this, but what it's looking like is that all of those things have been expanded, and new ICE officers who may have very little training are sort of also participating in that, or at least using the same tactics on everyone. And that expansion is what's really dangerous, because one thing is to go, against individuals who have extreme, criminal convictions. I think everyone can agree that if you've committed certain crimes in the United States, you're not going to stay, right? Like we're okay with detaining you and deporting you. But the expanded targeting model that they have is just with anyone. And so an individual without a criminal conviction who might only have a civil immigration violation, like overstaying their visa, but is otherwise eligible to stay once USCIS approves their petition. People who are encountered in the most minimal daily things. To me, a traffic ticket is nothing. To me, maybe an arrest for something very minor, also nothing, because I see the whole spectrum of things, right? So the fact that they're targeting individuals who sometimes don't even have any criminal status, that is the part that's just it's escalating, and their enforcement tactics are getting much more bigger. So we have expanded surveillance. We have increased operations, for example, in courthouses, where you used to be able to go to your immigration court hearing and there was virtually zero risk of ever being apprehended. Now that risk exists. And you're speaking with your immigration attorney about this. Like, am I at risk? Should I have a virtual hearing? Is that a possibility? What do I do if ICE shows up to my court hearing? Now, it's not in every state. It's not in every courthouse. But it does happen, and we didn't used to see that happening, right? We have additional enforcement activity at check-ins. I used to, for the longest time, tell people, go to your immigration check-in, you're fine, especially if you haven't committed a crime. Just call me after and tell me when the next one is so that we can add it to our calendar. Now, most of my clients want an attorney there present with them at the check-in because there is the possibility of being detained. And I've seen it being applied however they want. And that's what's very frustrating. If we really knew that these individuals with criminal convictions are the ones getting detained, it would be easier. But there's also individuals with nothing. following every single step that the government is giving them that are being detained. So that is what creates the fear amongst individuals. And I think people just need to be more prepared to explain their cases, more explained to have all their documents in order, rather than, oh, I don't even know when I applied, or I don't know where that paperwork is. I don't know where my passport is, right? People need to have everything in order, because that is what's going to potentially give you the best case scenario.
Thank you so much, Attorney Vilerka Solange Bilbao, for sharing your time and insight today. Your explanation helps clarify how enforcement priorities translate into real-world impact for undocumented individuals and non-citizen communities. And thanks to everyone who joined us. We hope today's discussion provides clarity, awareness, and practical understanding of current enforcement trends. You can always visit immigrationquestion.com to ask immigration-related questions and stay informed about upcoming discussions. If you'd like to revisit today's session or share it with others, the full replay will be available on Spotify soon. Just search Borderless Talk by immigrationquestion.com. Pardon me. Join us next week for another live conversation covering key immigration topics and current developments. Until then, stay informed and stay connected.
Thank you so much. It was great being here today.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much.